Good morning. Hi, everybody. Can everybody hear us?
Yeah, are we okay at this rate?
Yeah.
That's not volume? Okay.
Well, thank everybody for coming to what's kind of a niche program at 12:30 in the morning or early afternoon on Friday. So, my name is Pat Harrigan. I'll be the moderator.
I'm Alexandra House, participant.
And so the way that we've got this going on is right at the top here, I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes about William Blake, his life and his work. And then Alexandra and I are going to have more of a free-form discussion, and then I'll come back to a couple other little mini lectures or lecturettes that I want to pepper in about Blake for the remainder of the panel. And hopefully you won't get too tired of my voice. But and assuming that you don't, and if you're interested in anything that you hear today, please stick around after this panel discussion when Alexandra and I will be joined by Tim Uren to take an hour to recite 3 or 4 of Blake's medium-length prophetic poems, accompanied by slides of his artwork. So to start with, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is drawn from Northrop Frye's pioneering 1947 study of Blake called Fearful Symmetry. I know there's a lot of other scholarship about Blake that's been written since that time, but I'm not very familiar with it, so if what I say sounds a little old-fashioned, that's probably the reason. And most of the biographical details I'll mention are drawn from Peter Ackroyd's 1995 biography called Blake. So to start, I'd like to begin with a quotation from William Blake himself, which maybe you can keep in the back of your mind as I speak, because I'll come back to it later. It goes like this. What, it will be questioned, when the sun rises, do you not see a round disk of fire somewhat like a guinea? Oh, no, no. I see an innumerable company of the heavenly host crying, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. William Blake, an English poet and artist, lived from 1757 to 1827. He made his living as a professional illustrator and engraver. So, which means he would either copy pre-existing images, such as a painting, onto a printing plate, such that the image could be printed on paper, maybe then bound into a book, or sold individually as a print. Or he would be hired to create new drawings for a specific project, engrave or paint them himself, usually in watercolor. For example, he created engravings for an edition of the Book of Job, and when he died, he was working on illustrating Dante's Divine Comedy. There are a lot of odd stories about Blake's life that may or may not be true, but they crop up in every book or article written about him, so I thought it's worth mentioning. They say as a child, he told his mother he had visited with the prophet Ezekiel, who was sitting under a tree in their family garden. In Westminster Cathedral, he saw Christ, followed by a troop of angels. Later in his life, he saw a terrifying vision on his stairway, which he interpreted as being the soul of a murderer, who was now trapped in the body of a tiny flea, and though still bloodthirsty, was restrained from doing any real damage. When Blake painted this image later in his life, this ghost of a flea can only drink the blood of his victims from the cup of an acorn. There's a lot that's very strange about William Blake, and I hope that my poor attempts today at explaining his life in poetry don't tempt you to dismiss him as just another boring figure in the history of English poetry, or as a meaningless weirdo, because he's much more interesting than any of that. There's one thing I really want to stress up top. He was poor. He was a hard-working person his entire life, and his poetic and artistic work and the poetic vision that underlay it went along with him side by side with getting up every day and scraping to make a living. He was not a bourgeois or an aristocrat who had money and the leisure time to support a poetic hobby. He was a working person. He was also a very difficult person. He considered humility to be a form of hypocrisy. He was not an easy person to like, and his biography contains several instances of his acquiring friends and patrons who believed in him and supported his work, whom Blake would later fall out with, usually for obscure reasons and then slander at every opportunity. The only person who really seemed to find him sympathetic in the long term was his wife, Catherine. They were devoted to one another. She was illiterate when they met, and he taught her to read and write. She assisted him regularly in his work, including coloring many of the engraved plates, and outlived him by a little over 4 years. I want to talk about the sketch for a second. That's a sketch of Catherine by her husband in 1805 when she was about 43 years old. I think it's lovely. It's a demure image, kind of bashful. She looks a little sad too, maybe, although I'm not sure if that was the intention behind that. It's said that on the last day of his life, he put aside his work on the illustrations of Dante and said, "Stay, Kate, keep just as you are. I will draw your portrait, for you have ever been an angel to me," and drew the portrait. There are a lot of stories, as I said, about Blake that sound a little too good to be true, and to my ear, this is maybe one of them. But in any case, if he did draw her portrait that day, it's been lost. No one's ever seen it. Here's one of Catherine from the year following Blake's death, 1828, painted by, or illustrated by family friend Frederick Tatum, who gave her a home to live in after Blake's death. Now, this is a much more severe, sharp image. She would have been about 62 here. It's about 20 years after the previous one we saw. In the last years of her life, she said that she spoke with her husband from beyond the grave. Now, inasmuch as you can say that Blake published any poetry during his life, he did it himself, not through a traditional publishing house. His early work includes a few short books of lyrical pieces, some prose items, a couple odd unfinished dramatic works, plus the books Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. And it's from those two books that you get most of the poems people are familiar with, specifically poems like Tiger, 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 Burning Bright, and the poem London, which people tend to read at high school English class. Do you teach?
You know, I'm an English teacher, high school English and literature teacher by trade. And honestly, I would say Lake isn't always accessible, but the ones, that do tend to get shown for poetry contests and whatnot tend to be Tiger, Tiger. I know it's one that's often memorized, and then students are always like, but symmetry doesn't rhyme with, and they, but the different accents and all that. So, Blake's been more of my own sort of personal thing. Though now I'm kind of thinking I need to get back into and see what, because I think sometimes there's an inaccessibility with some of his work for some folks. So.
I would definitely say a lot of it is inaccessible, or at least is perceived to be, and that's hopefully something that we'll be able to explain a little bit today. But it's true that as he went on, his poems became more and more ambitious. They grew to works of about 300 lines each in the poems Europe, a Prophecy, and America, a Prophecy, which we'll be reading after this panel. And then something like 2,000 lines in his poem Milton, and 3,000 lines for his final poem Jerusalem. That's about 1/5 the size of the Iliad or Dante's Divine Comedy, so those are not short poems. Also, and this is very important, he was at least as much of a visual artist as he was a poet, and in fact, in his mind, there was very little distinction in him between those two things. The engraving process worked something like this. Cover copper plates with wax, etch the words and images backward into the wax. Bathe the plates in acid to dissolve the exposed metal areas, clean them, ink the plates, and press them onto paper with a hand press. And then he and Catherine would hand color the printed images. In later life, he developed a technique where he would apply colored pigment directly to the plates and press the color into the paper along with the lines. Now, Jerusalem by itself consists of 100 engraved plates, so you can see already that to do the kind of work he did in the way that he did it demanded a lifelong commitment to his vision and the physical stamina to keep it going. His biographer, Peter Ackroyd, says, "Words for him were objects carved out of metal." And as a consequence of this bespoke procedure, no two versions of any one of his prints are exactly the same. Here's another version of the Tiger, for instance, printed and colored at a different point in Blake's life. Look at how different they are.
Yeah.
And then there's this guy. He's hilarious. He looks super friendly.
He's very happy Tiger.
Dopey.
Yeah.
He doesn't really seem like a terrifying,
Symmetry's off a little bit.
terrifying figure stalking through the forests of the night. I think I know why he's so silly. It's because for Blake talks a lot about animals and the natural world in his poems, but when it comes to his visual imagination, all of that doesn't really interest him that much. He's interested in the human body. And although he can capture the natural world symbologically in his poetry, in his visual art, it's all the male and female forms. The Ghost of the Flea that we saw earlier is horrifying because it's a work corrupted version of the human body. This grinning tiger is too far away from our own bodies for Blake to really take the time to be interested in it, at least in my opinion. Quick sidebar, in Blake's poem, The Four Zoas, there's a lovely couple of lines when the character Los and his lover Enitharmon are working to create something of compassion and beauty out of the ruins of our fallen world. And the lines go, "And first he drew a line upon the walls of shining heaven, and Enitharmon tinctured it with beams of blushing love." Image of Catherine coloring her husband's drawing. I guess irresistible. And as we've said, Blake's work is also very challenging. He's best understood in the context of ongoing 18th century debates about philosophy, theology, and politics, most of which are kind of inaccessible to us today, and we don't really have time to get into them at the moment. But confusion and perplexity are part of the cost of reading Blake, and if I can accomplish anything here today, it's to convince you that he's worth studying regardless of anything. God knows, I've spent the last 2 years struggling with him. We were supposed to do this panel at CONvergence 2020, which didn't happen. And I love him, even though I can only understand him about half the time. And sometimes you'll hear people calling him insane, which is a pretty shallow way of looking at it. His work has a logic and an internal coherence that is complex and difficult to understand, but it is far from the ravings of a disordered brain. It just takes some work to get into it. His symbolism is highly individual. He stands a little apart from the broader English poetic tradition, and so he has to be read in a different way than you would read like Wordsworth or Keats. He quite thoroughly rejected the main touchstones of his era, classical Greece and Rome. He hated them. His main influences were John Milton and the Bible. And a lot of his near contemporaries, like Keats, for instance, were very into medieval stuff, especially King Arthur and his knights, but there isn't much of that in Blake at all, with the conspicuous exception of Dante, who he had kind of a complicated relationship with, and struggled with his forefather. They both expressed these universally encompassing theologies and complex poetic world building, and Blake admired him extremely highly, but he didn't approve of Dante's Catholic focus on sin, punishment, and redemption. Nonetheless, Blake completed 102 drawings and 7 engravings for Dante's Divine Comedy before he died. And there's a rich vein of Blake's scholarship which discusses exactly how much Blake, let's say, accurately expressed Dante's idea in his art, and how much Blake impressed his own idiosyncratic ideas onto his illustrations of Dante. Like a lot of things, we don't have time to get into that today. So, by way of preamble, here is a hilariously compressed and shallow summary of Blake's work. Peter Ackroyd says, Blake's work arises from the sure knowledge that nature and the material world are the vessels of eternity. What does that mean? Blake says, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For Blake, that means we live in a fallen world full of pain and woe and shackles, but if mankind can struggle its way to a better way of understanding, through poetic vision and imagination, we could see a vision of eternity in which we finally realize the eternal city of God, which is the New Jerusalem, in which the lion lays down with the lamb, and we are all one within the eternal body of Christ, which is God, but which is also our body, the human body. God appears, and God is light to those poor souls who dwell in night, but does a human form display to those who dwell in realms of day. For Blake, the divine form is identical to the human form, if correctly perceived. It follows from this that it's the job of the poetic visionary to struggle against any form of material tyranny that might interfere with this sort of understanding of eternity, and that's exactly what he did, a little privately. He wasn't really a public figure. He was opposed to political tyranny, such as the British Empire of his day. He was enthusiastic about the American and French revolutions, at least until it became clear that the American Revolution, at least, wasn't going to abolish human slavery, which he abhorred. He hated the English church, which he viewed as a source of sexual hypocrisy. Prisons are built with stones of law, brothels with bricks of religion, he said. He said quite alarming things about the institution of marriage, which he compared to a sort of slavery, and was a champion of free love ideas, although by all accounts he never put them into practice, and his marriage with Catherine seems to have been quite a solid and happy one. When you read Blake, you'll find that he constantly mentions how much he hates Isaac Newton, Francis Bacon, and John Locke. The great figures of empiricism and the scientific understanding of the world. He really gets quite animated about it. And this is because their sort of empiricism is fundamentally opposed to how Blake views the world. So to categorize and measure things the way a scientist does means saying that that tree and that other tree are in some way the same, that they're part of the same species or genus, for instance. And the differences between them, height, number of leaves, whatever, can be measured against one another and against the idea of a common or typical tree. Taken to its logical conclusion, the entire world, trees, animals, human beings, can be measured, weighed, categorized, and put into boxes in this way. For Blake, this was a sort of tyranny. For Blake, things are never the same. There is no common or typical. That tree, when understood through the lens of poetic vision, is nothing like that other tree, much less can any man be anything like any other man. Nor should they be treated in the same way. And here's where this ties into his political and social concerns. One law for the lion and ox is oppression, he says. And I want to make sure to add that Blake isn't saying that Newton and Locke are wrong exactly. He's not going to argue about the laws of motion or whether atoms exist, but he's saying that their form of understanding is restrictive, almost irrelevant, and by its nature it attempts to limit the scope of a genuine poetic vision. Northrop Frye says, the first point in Blake to get clear then is the infinite superiority of the distinct perception of things to the attempt of memory to classify them into general principles. Blake refuses, as he puts it, to deduct from a rose its redness, from a lily its whiteness, from a diamond its hardness, from a sponge its softness, from an oak its height, from a daisy its lowness. Over and over again in Blake's paintings and engravings, you can always tell when some character is a villain because they're measuring things, a ruler or a compass or something. This famous painting of Newton, it's Isaac Newton there, undignified.
I know, yeah.
Newton features that, as does Blake's even more famous image of Urizen, the Ancient of Days, measuring the world. The world as Urizen creates it in the four Zoas, for he divided day and night in different ordered portions, the day for war, the night for secret religion in the temple. In other places, Blake will talk about other ways Urizen divides the world, through his laws, through his arts. Blake's vision, this is Northrop Frye again, revolves around four antitheses: imagination and memory in thought, innocence and experience in religion, liberty and tyranny in society, outline and imitation in art. All of these being aspects of the antithesis of life and death. The poetic vision was a very individual thing, and it somehow operates outside of what we would call normal historical influence. Blake loved both Raphael and Michelangelo, but he said, I do not believe that Raphael taught Michelangelo or that Michelangelo taught Raphael any more than I believe that the rose teaches the lily how to grow or the apple tree teaches the pear tree how to bear fruit. And before I end this section, because most of the rest of what I want to talk about today is going to revolve around how Blake's poetic practice, I want to draw one last example about how these ideas operated in his political and social imagination. There's one line in the Four Zoas where he tells us that, quote, the arts of Urizen were pity and meek affection. What's wrong with pity and meek affection, you might ask, right? They sound like pretty good things, but it's a very good question, and it's a good example of how slippery it can sometimes be to keep abreast of the way Blake is thinking. He uses the word pity all the time in his poems. At one point he says, for mercy has a human heart, pity a human face. And he's definitely not opposed to meekness either. Jesus, as the Lamb of God, is meek. In one of Blake's poems he says, he is meek and he is mild, he became a little child. But think about how he uses those simple words here. Meekness is one thing when we're talking about the baby Jesus. It suggests another thing when we're talking about affection. What sort of affection? That of a husband for his wife? There's a quote in Graham Greene's novel, The End of the Affair, where a character talks about a love affair and she says, love dies, affection and habit win the day. What about other people? A meek affection of a man for his brother, man, that's a pretty humble thing, and I wouldn't want to base any sort of relationship on that sort of affection. And pity, what does it mean that I pity someone? That I pity you? What does it mean that someone pities the African slaves, for example, that at the exact time that Blake is writing this poem, were being kidnapped from Africa and taken to be enslaved in the Americas? The transatlantic slave trade was outlawed in England in 1807, the same year Blake finished or abandoned work on his poem, The Four Zoas. During the composition of the poem, those arguments were everywhere in England. Moral, economic, practical arguments. Most people, except the most callous, felt pity for the enslaved people. But was pity the right response? Blake would say, of course not. And affection shouldn't be meek either. Instead of pity, what you need is anger, or as Blake would more likely call it, wrath. Wrath being a very William Blake kind of word. And instead of meek affection, you need passion, and behind both of those things is powerful energy. What Blake will symbolize in his poetry by certain characters. First, someone called Orc, and then someone called Los. And we're going to get back to those couple of guys in a bit, but I've gone on quite long enough, and we need to hear from Alexandra.
Oh, sure, no. Like I said, I enjoy this format because it's, I guess I don't mind the professorial lecture format, but I think some of the things that we had talked about in relation to Blake were just in discussion. It was just bringing me back to like, how did I even first hear and discover Blake in my life? And it kind of took me on this journey back. Because for me, it wasn't like Tiger or anything like that. It was because when I was in high school, I was just obsessed with the 1960s and the Doors. All right, still love the Doors, love Jim Morrison. And so I was like, okay, I'm 14, I'm gonna read The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley. And I think that's what took me on this journey of okay, Jim Morrison, who based his band The Doors on The Doors of Perception, which comes from the quote that we just heard, that if the doors of perception were closed, everything would appear to man as it is infinite. And so this kind of took me back amidst my journey of reading Huxley, who was really inspired by Blake to, if you're not familiar, to take mescaline in the 1960s, which is what that book was based on. And I was kind of fascinated that whereas Blake's sort of spiritual approach and insight into sort of humanity and how he saw the world, Huxley was like, okay, I'm going to do this through this other means. And so it's kind of fascinating to me that Blake, as we heard as a child, was already sort of having these visions, or whatever we want to call them. And for him, that was this natural thing, whereas Huxley had to actually take something to sort of open these doors for himself. And I guess that just kind of fascinates me that Blake, what a mind to see the world in such a unique way, and that I feel like his insight into humanity is just so profound and so very modern for today, because we've talked about that, where he was completely, people did not read him. It's kind of like the Van Gogh of his day, you know? Here's all this incredible, you know, his artwork with his poetry and his view of the world, and yet it was like, and being a British man at the, you know, and viewing America. And
Must have been exciting.
yeah, it must have been great, you know, oh, I'm really digging what's going on in the colonies right now. And everyone else, maybe not so much.
And you visited with Blake and Catherine, right?
I did. When I studied in London, and it's funny, I'm an English teacher now, right? I remember my English teacher in high school used to go to the graves of famous writers and take photos of their graves, and I remember thinking, oh, and then here I am. So when I was studying in London, and when I went to Paris, so I could visit Jim Morrison as well, and other famous writers in Père Lachaise, but I went on my own trip to Bun Hill Fields, which I don't know if anyone's been there, but it's a now defunct cemetery, so there are no new burials taking place there. So I'd say probably the average age of the graves in this little site are probably, you know, around 1800 before and after that, because they stopped. And it's very innocuous. I remember having to kind of figure out the tube map and walk a ways. And it's in this very residential modern area. You can kind of see some apartments back there. And The writer of Pilgrim's Progress is also here, Bunyan, as well as Willem Dafoe. So,
Daniel.
or excuse me, I just like Daniel Defoe. I'm not the biggest Defoe fan, we'll just say. Okay. So I visited them as well, but of course I was there to see Blake, because I was, this sort of obsession and interest of mine that came from my previous readings of literature. And you can see someone has left a little orange as I believe, an offering. And like I said, to me, it's just such an innocuous grave for who I would consider is just an incredible mind and artist. And he's not at Westminster, he's not in Poets' Corner with all of these other writers.
What neighborhood of London is this, like geographically, south, north, south?
I'll have to look it up really quick, I forgot to.
It's probably not far from where they live, because they
No.
lived in London the whole life.
Yeah, and I forget if it's kind of southwest-ish, let me look it up really quick. But it did take a bit to find it.
Yeah, Lambeth was a working class neighborhood in his time.
Yeah.
Lots of printers and things.
Yeah, and I had looked this up before. Yeah, Islington. So that's actually just a little bit north, which
Okay.
would make sense kind of demographically at the time.
We took him out of his neighborhood.
Yeah, what I think is interesting, so I think this specific cemetery was created about 1660s. And it was just called, I think, like a Bone Hill. They would have used that term back in the day, and then eventually took on a different name. And so, you often visit graves, like, I guess in contrast to Jim Morrison, since I mentioned him, which is covered with kisses and whiskey bottles and all this sort of stuff, right? It's just so, that's it. I don't know, I would love to know who kind of brought those little flowers and everything for him.
May I ask the question?
Yes, of course, yeah.
Just real quick. Was there anybody besides God that Blake admired? Any human? Did he admire any human?
Yeah, John Milton.
Yeah, Milton, which
Oh, yeah,
which I think
Dante.
is,
Yeah.
No, but contemporarily?
He had kind of a complicated relationship with Lord Byron. They never
Yes.
met, but
his British contemporary, like they were
yeah, he was very.
very much in different worlds, I would say.
Yeah, It depends on the time of his life that you're asking, because he would enthuse over certain people for a certain period of time. If they're friends of his. Then, as I said, they would kind of often have a falling out.
Thank you.
Yeah, because as we mentioned, I'll be reading America Prophecy later, which very much, he mentions Washington and Greene and Hayne and some of these revolutionary patriots, but of course that was soured later on, because if we had remained a British colony, we would have outlawed slavery far sooner than unfortunately happened here, so, yeah.
It was really post Blake's life, posthumously, that people started to really kind of take up on him.
Right. Yeah, and then we had kind of gotten this conversation of just, I had to bring this up because there is we were hoping to go to the Institute of Arts before this, because they do have some of his lithograph, right?
That's the one.
This is the one that's actually here that it's not on display, but you're able to request to see it. And so of course if you're familiar with, Hannibal and Thomas Harris making some jokes about please don't eat the William Blake lithograph because of course the Great Red Dragon from Red Dragon.
He did 4 Red Dragon pictures. These are them.
Yeah. And if you're familiar with that, being a fan of horror and thrillers, and I think that was another fascination for me with Thomas Harris. First of all, Thomas Harris has his crime background, in creating the figure of Hannibal Lecter, but Red Dragon is not really as much about Hannibal Lecter as this character, Francis Dollarhide, who is obsessed with the Red Dragon here. And I think it's interesting that, like I said, I think this mythology of Blake has sort of outgrown who he even is, or really is. And so people kind of are maybe introduced to him in other ways, where I remember seeing this great Red Dragon thinking, oh, what a hellish image, and and then we have this character obsessed with it, especially this one,
Yeah.
you know, just this muscle back and these wings and how even today, even though I would say, you know, besides maybe Tiger, I think a lot of people are maybe getting access to Blake through these other sort of pop culture modern things, and then hopefully maybe that takes people down the rabbit hole of maybe, you know, getting to some of his reading and his artwork here. Like I'm a big Milton and Dante fan too, so that also was a connection for me with Blake, because I've always been interested in that sort of kind of, how to put it, like spirituality and trying to figure it out in a more kind of modern sense that works versus maybe a more ancient sense. And I was raised Catholic, so there's a lot of mythology and ritual within the Catholic faith as well. And so that made me think of Philip Pullman with his Dark Materials trilogy.
There's your Aldous Huxley.
Yeah, and yeah, there's my Aldous. I love those old book covers. Yeah.
Somebody dropped a tiger on this version.
Yeah, I know, this one's
It's
got
Dark
one of the, the soul. So again, I think it's interesting. I think we're getting modern day versions of sort of what Blake was doing with some of his mythology and these characters, but in other ways. You know, because Pullman himself is dealing with spirituality and the authority of a church, and is that a good thing for our soul, you know, in our lives? What does that mean? And for love and
Yeah, I think Pullman's trilogy there is probably one of the works I can think of that actually engages with Blake's work.
I agree.
In a more than superficial way.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Thomas Harris example it's not
Yeah.
totally superficial, but it is.
Yeah,
it isn't
it's
good.
a setup for this serial killer, right?
Yeah.
That's essentially it. Yeah.
But Pullman has complex philosophical ideas underlying his fantasy series.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting how very Blake-like his Dark Materials is to me without directly invoking Blake or alluding to him in any way. But
The anti-C.S. Lewis.
yeah, and again, a British writer, right? So we have Pullman who's familiar with this tradition and sets these books in Oxford, you know, an intellectual academic space amidst everything else that's going on in them. And I know we also were talking about Philip was a farmer, because we started then kind of going into the world of film after spending a bit of time in books. So book World of Tears, where like the family is named after a number of
Yeah, the World of Tears books, Philip Hossein Farmer is most known for his Riverworld series
right. I
of
mean,
novels.
that's it. Yeah. World of
There was an
World of
earlier
Tears.
series called World of Tears.
Yeah.
I haven't read them myself, but my understanding is that the heroes go through different levels of existence, which have different metaphysical components to them.
Right.
So there's like the ancient Norse gods is one of them, the ancient Greek gods is one, and one of the tiers is
Jonathan.
yeah, it has characters from Blake
Yeah.
in it. In a later book.
Yeah, at least in
Right.
name.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A later book of his, which is sort of part of that series called Red Orc's Rage, Orc being a character we'll talk about in a few minutes
Yeah.
here.
Mm-hmm.
But mostly people do kind of superficial
Yeah.
approaches to Blake. If anyone's seen the very good Jim Jarmusch movie Dead Man,
Fantastic.
it's one of my favorite films, but if you listen to Jarmusch's commentary, he pretty much admits that it has almost nothing to do with William Blake whatsoever. The character Johnny Depp plays is named William Blake, but it's really about Native American spirituality. That's what the movie is about. And Jarmusch just happened to pick up a volume of Blake at the time and was struck by the coincidence of some of the philosophical ideas in it, and so it started just peppered the movie with a lot of Blake's poems.
Yeah, because the premise is that Depp's character is they believe he's the reincarnation of Blake.
The character,
Yeah, the
nobody
character.
knows.
Yeah, nobody, this other character, yeah. But yeah, I'd say it's definitely stronger on the native indigenous spiritualism versus Blake's mythology.
He's also, he's been an inspiration for musicians quite frequently. Benjamin Britten set a lot of his poems to music. Jaw Wobble, Tangerine
Which
Dream.
I think we have up there, yep, Tiger. It's like, I think if you spell Tiger with the Y, it's just kind of automatic Blake.
It really is.
It really brings that, invokes that.
I quite like this one, by the way. It's not for everybody's taste, but I
Yeah.
like it a lot.
Yeah, I think Should we do a comment or question right there?
Sure, were there?
Person right here in the,
Yeah, I think just when you were talking about Blake and religious authority, I was wondering, did he have any kind of views on the Gnostic Gospels? Because it would seem like he would care a lot about that, given that they were kind of suppressed by ecclesiastic authority.
yeah,
Not to my knowledge, I may not have been aware of them.
yeah.
He was able to read Greek. I don't remember any Gnosticism in the biography that I've read. It's kind of more of a biblical literalist in the sense that whatever the received text of the Testaments during his time would probably be what he was working off of.
Yeah, which is because he could have encountered them in working with Dante, but I don't hear any evidence.
Should we talk about names?
Yeah, we can talk about names.
Talk about
Yeah, because
names.
like I said, there's a whole vocabulary we'll get to in a moment
Oh,
to help kind of set up, especially some of the stuff we're going to read later.
sorry, did I talk over somebody's question?
No, I just know you had your hand up there.
Oh, I just had a quick question.
Yeah.
So you mentioned like the quote where he's talking about like a different rule for oxen.
Same rule for the lion and the ox.
And the ox.
Is oppression.
Is oppression.
But so then, but it sounded like he was kind of like over the equality of man. So like is it?
Yes,
Does that
and
help?
these sort of contradictions are kind of the reward of reading Blake in a sense. But essentially, what he means is that you can't treat those creatures in exactly the same way. You can't be treated in the same way that I can be treated. It doesn't follow then that one of us should be enslaved, but
Yeah, to me, it was his attempt at, I guess, what we would call equity.
Also, those were from Proverbs of Hell, and they're kind of hell. So
Mhm.
they are all a little bit almost Cohen-like in a sense. They're supposed to provoke analysis or thought, or to be a little bit jarring. I mean, drive your plow over the bones of the dead. It's like, okay.
sooner murder an infant in its cradle than nurse unacted desire.
Yes.
I think it's probably hopefully
No
not
bird,
being literal
you
there.
hide fluid from him. Stuff like that.
Yeah, I'm not going to talk much about this, but thank you for bringing it
Yeah.
up. It is exactly that kind of deliberately paradoxical or antagonistic flavor that it
Yeah.
brings to a lot of his poetic work. We're going to talk a little bit more about the prophecies, though.
Yes,
We're going to
prophecies.
go a little deeper here into some definitions and names.
Yeah.
So Peter Ackroyd says about Blake, much of his prophetic symbolism can actually be understood without undue difficulty, but it requires in the reader a reawakening of what is essentially a clear and simple vision. He is a difficult poet only if we decide to make him so. Having said that, one of the challenges of reading Blake is the preponderance of strange names and unusual uses of words that you think you know. Just to get the sound of some of these names in your ear. Fel, Los, Enitharmon, Urizen, Orc, Theotormon, Ahania, Owathawan, Golganuza, Alamanda, Bolhula. These are some of the names you'll hear in Blake. Those are characters and places that recur over and over again in a lot of his different poems. Now, about those names, other poets writing the sort of allegorical poems that Blake wrote would most likely have used pre-established mythological characters to make their points. They would use Zeus or Jove to symbolize a patriarchal sky god, Venus to symbolize erotic or sexual love, Mars to symbolize war and conflict. This was very commonplace about 200 or so years before Blake in Elizabethan poems like Edmund Spenser or Shakespeare. Blake does not do that, and not just because he was sort of temperamentally an anti-classicist, like we've said. His character Urizen is a sky god, and Blake's character Vala represents a sort of natural love. But Blake uses those names and not Jove and Venus because he doesn't mean Jove or Venus. He doesn't want to bring those sorts of associations that we as readers bring in when we hear names like Jove and Venus. This is an individual vision, his vision. Plus, those characters might operate in different ways in different poems. Peter Ackroyd says, he was above everything else an artist and not an orthodox thinker. He was attracted to images or phrases as a means of interpretation and never espoused a complete or coherently organized body of knowledge. So just because a character, like Urizen say, operates in a particular way in a particular poem and seems to carry a specific sort of symbolic meaning, it may be the case that he symbolizes something a little bit different in another poem. In a sense, Blake's characters act more like characters in a drama than the strictly symbolic figures you might expect from poetry. Northrop Frye calls them a repertory company. Another handhold to use when reading Blake, his vocabulary and his poetic grammar are generally pretty simple. He doesn't use the sorts of obscurities or archaicisms that some of the other 17th and 18th century poets did, and his syntax isn't really all that difficult to follow. Here's an example from the Four Zoas. The echo wakes the moon to unbind her silver locks. The golden sun bears on my song, and 9 bright spheres of harmony rise round the fiery king. The joy of woman is the death of her most best beloved, who dies of love for her in torments of fierce jealousy and pangs of adoration. I venture to say you understood every individual word in those lines: echo, moon, silver, gold, harmony, king, death, love, jealousy, adoration. The challenge lies in seeing exactly how those simple terms work together within Blake's idiosyncratic vision. How does the echo awake the moon? What are the 9 bright spheres of harmony? Is it true that the joy of woman is the death of her most best beloved, who dies of love for her? Those are the sorts of questions that would provide the challenge and the joy of reading William Blake. It's also true that Blake will sometimes use familiar words in unfamiliar ways. I want to mention 2 of the most important ones here: prophecy and imagination. Prophecy. We think of a prophecy as something that foretells the future. But when Blake talks about prophecy, as in the titles of America a prophecy and Europe a prophecy, he isn't predicting the future, although that might be an incidental part of what he's doing. Blake's prophecy is describing things that are happening right now. He's describing things as they really are and trying to make us see that through the lens of his poetic imagination. And imagination, we tend to think of imagination as a sort of mental creation of things that are not real, imaginary things. That is the exact opposite of Blake's meaning. For Blake, imagination is the process of the artistic understanding of the world, which is the same thing as the artistic creation of the world. Blake fundamentally rejects the philosophical position of someone like John Locke and other Enlightenment philosophers that divide the world into subject and object, the thing perceiving and the thing being perceived. For Blake, we apprehend the world through our senses, but our senses are just the tools our souls use. So what we are really doing when we perceive the world is creating it within ourselves, within our souls, and this act of poetic creation is what Blake calls imagination. What's more, this act of creation isn't just similar to the act of God's universal creation, it is, because we are all God, the same thing as God's act of creation. Blake viewed this act of creation in profoundly moral terms. A spirit and a vision are not, as the modern philosophy supposes, a cloudy vapor or a nothing. They are organized and minutely articulated beyond all that the mortal and perishing nature can produce. He who does not imagine in stronger and better lineaments and in stronger and better light than his perishing mortal eye can see does not imagine at all. I know of no other Christianity and of no other gospel than the liberty both of body and mind to exercise the divine arts of the imagination. The eternal body of man is the imagination, all caps. That is God himself. That's what I got for now.
I know. I know. How many of you? I know how many of you moment? Because I even just hearing some of these things again, I'm just kind of, my mind is blown. I think that's what makes Blake so much fun, because growing up and even now, like I loved, and I think that's probably what drew some of these other artists to. There's almost a surrealism to it, but not. And I think it's just because I'm trying to use my modern understanding of where Blake's coming from. But I'm like, I guess when I took philosophy classes in college, I'm kind of surprised Blake wasn't in there too.
He's so individual. He's so idiosyncratic.
Mm-hmm.
Did he perceive a creator God as having like a individual intelligence beyond the communal being of humanity?
I would say probably yes, but now we're getting into kind of deep theological waters that I'm not competent to discuss. He hated what in the 18th century would be called natural philosophy,
Yeah.
which of course John Locke.
Yeah, it would have been Locke, yeah.
The sort of the idea that you can understand the nature of God and the universe by simply observing the material things and kind of deducing from there what it is. So he's much more of a throwback, you know. It's like this is the revealed word of God in the Bible. His very kind of unusual interpretations of the Bible in some part, but what that meant in terms of individual, characters in his work are both individual and communal. The same, but the giant Albion, who we'll talk about later, is
Yes.
not only the eternal man, but he's also England, he's also humanity as a whole.
Yeah.
We'll get to that in a little bit.
Yeah.
Hustle through work.
Yeah, sure, and
So-
then maybe we can get to some of other comments out there, yeah.
Got it.
Make sure other people need to know who work is.
So, let's talk about the orc cycle. Northrop Frye identifies a particular set of symbolic images that run throughout much of Blake's poetry, which he calls the orc cycle. I'm going to talk about the word orc for a minute. In Blake, orc is a particular character. It's not a race of creatures like it is in Tolkien. There's no connection. Tolkien derived the word from an Anglo-Saxon word meaning demon or goblin, which might have come from the Roman underworld god Orcus. Blake probably adapted the name from Orcus too, although as with all of Blake's peculiar names, there's a lot of disagreement about where it actually came from, what it might be intended to be. In any case, orc in Blake is a symbol of rebellion and youthful power, passion, and energy. He's often described as red or ruddy. He's full of blood. Remember that Philip Zane Farmer titled his book Red Orc's Rage. Orcs sort of a little bit like Satan from Milton's Paradise Lost, but I don't want to go there too much because there have been a lot of orcs in history. Christ was orc, for example. The American and French revolutions are expressions of orc. His opponent is the sky god Urizen, who we saw earlier, who's old, white-haired, and white-bearded. In Blake's illustrations, he looks exactly like you think the Old Testament God looks like, and that's extremely deliberate. For Blake, the God that the church teaches about is not God at all, but Urizen, the old man, senile, tyrannical, and cruel, destined to be overthrown by Orc, the symbol of energy and rebellion. But Orc, when he overthrows Urizen, slows and ages himself, so in the normal course of things, Orc becomes Urizen. And we sink again into stagnation, political tyranny, abstract religion, material science. And when this Urizen gets overthrown, in his turn, his death, he dies, and in his death he becomes Satan, which for Blake means warfare, the death of the soul, and the descent into chaos. Then the cycle begins again with a new orc. So this entire cycle from orc to Urizen to Satan, and then back to a form of potential new life, which Blake sometimes calls Tharmas, is repeated over and over again in human history, and you can already see that it sort of seems like a trap. Is there any way out of it? Is all of history just an endless repetition of this orc cycle? Blake doesn't think so, but in order to break into something new, we need a new character who can operate outside of this cycle, and in later poems this character is Los, the spiritual form of time, the Holy Spirit who spoke to the prophets, the divine blacksmith. We'll come back to him in a minute.
Questions? Yeah, I know. Maybe,
Eric,
should we start, oh yeah.
The comment I would have is Urizen. I remember my professor talking about how we would play on words with reason. When you talk about him being a villain in a lot of Blake's work, I honestly bounced off a lot of the prophecy stuff or something. I'm glad you come back.
Most people do, yeah.
But yeah, that like, and with his sort of dislike of pure reason stuff, that seems fitting that would be the villain.
I think there's a lot of disagreement, again, as I've said, about like the meanings of these particular names, because he didn't leave any kind of...
Or even pronunciation.
Yeah, I'm calling him Urizen just because...
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion around
Urizen.
how these names fit into Blake's perceived meter in these poems. So there's still a lot of discussion around scholars of is it this, for to fit whether it's the meter or, as you said, this sort of play on words, yeah.
And as you said, the interpretation of it as being derived from your reason is a very common interpretation. A lot of people believe that. Other people have talked about it coming from horizon, or something to E, the
Yeah,
UR preface. Again, He didn't leave us any explanation.
Yeah, most of the time I spent prepping for, I'll be reading America later, was just, I went to numerous sources for some pronunciation, but yeah, I heard it numerous ways, and it depends on if you're a person with an English accent reading it versus American, so I'm like,
Have
I'm
you
gonna
won
go, I'm
those?
gonna go with, yeah. Yeah, but and so I came across numerous articles about still, scholars quibbling about these things because we don't know.
Eric, and then we'll talk about the history of the world.
So with the imagination, being created within us, is he then, like, is it cursive? Is he saying that the world we perceive is someone else's imagination, or?
We're all kind of the same. We're all the body of the community ourselves. It's a very good question, I think, about whether we're meant to understand his poetic vision as being true in a like broad sense, like a mystical sense,
Yeah.
or whether we could all have our own versions of Blake's poetic imagination that doesn't use his vocabulary or his imagery
Yes.
or whatever. And it's unclear. He sort of encompasses the world in his own imagination, I think. I think it's
I think that's
fairly
the
clear that
answer, right?
Let's talk quickly about the history of the world. So over the years, Orc tended to disappear from Blake's poems, and in general, a larger cast of characters start to appear, as well as a much more elaborate symbolic structure that supersedes and kind of contradicts the Orc cycle I talked about earlier. I'm going to cover this part of things very lightly, because it's kind of complicated, and it would be easy to get lost in the weeds. But Blake has a very complex and utterly inaccurate view of human history, derived from the Bible and various dubious histories that he read. It actually incorporates the sinking of Atlantis, and there's a suggestion that modern Ethiopians are descendants of the ancient Atlanteans. Well, we don't have time to get into all that right now. It's very strange. In his imaginative history, the world is 6,000 years old, and the Orc cycle has occurred 7 times. In the most recent cycle, Orc appeared in the world as Christ, and this indicates that the endless cycle is coming to an end and something new is arriving. An unusual thing about Blake is that he tends to conceive of things in fours. He talks about the fourfold man. Within Western Christian tradition, artists tend to think in threes. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, past, present, future, etc. Dante, for example, is all about threes. But for Blake, 3 is the number of cyclic occurrence, the trap of the Orc cycle, but 4 is the number of what Northrop Frye calls infinite extension. There's a numerological element to Blake's later poems, with numbers made out of 4s like 16 or 64 signifying imaginative achievement, and numbers made out of 3s like 9 and 27, or of course 666, associated with Antichrist. So where do these 4s come from? The central image to keep in mind here is the heavenly chariot of the book of Ezekiel, covered in eyes and drawn by 4 living creatures, a lion, an eagle, an ox, and a man. Here's a famous version, Raphael's, from 1518. Biblical theology associates these with the 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But Blake is, as you might imagine, more eccentric than that. In the translation of the Bible that he read, the word is translated as beasts. The original Greek is something like zoa, so Blake calls them the 4 zoas. Blake's version of Ezekiel, by the way. That is just marvelous.
Yeah.
And for good measure, here's another chariot again by Blake. This is Blake's watercolor illustration of Beatrice addressing Dante in cantos 29 and 30 of the Purgatorio. So what are these zoas? In Blake's vision, the primeval man, who he calls Albion, falls and is divided into 4 parts. Ulro, or hell, is a single or hermaphroditic world of reflected abstractions. This is the realm of memory and abstraction. Generation, or what Blake sometimes calls the vegetable world, is the world of our common everyday existence. It is the world divided into the Lockean subject and object, and so it's a double world. Beulah is a world of beauty and sexual love, and because it consists of lover, beloved, and child, it is a triple world. Finally, Eden, the 4-fold world, is one of imagination, love, wisdom, and power. These states of being correspond to characters within Blake, some of whom we've already met. Eden is Urzan. Beulah is Tharmas. Generation is Orc and the corresponding female version of Orc named Vala, who together are named Luva. And Urthona is Los. These are the 4 zoas, the 4 parts of the broken giant Albion. Don't worry if you can't remember all this. I'm going over it mostly to indicate how his imagination works. But bear with me because it's going to get a little while The four Zoas exist in two forms. They're eternal forms and the forms they take within time. I've touched on this a little before, but to make it more explicit, within time, the eternal form of Luva is known as Orc. Within time, the eternal form of Urizen is known as Satan. Urthona appears as Los, and Tharmas appears as the covering cherub, an obscure figure, again from the book of Ezekiel, we don't have time to talk about right now. Each of these male figures also have a female form, which Blake calls emanations. The female form of Orc is Vala, the female form of Satan is Ahania, the cherub's form is Enian, and Los's female form might be Enetharmon, though even Northrop Frye seems a little uncertain about that one. What exactly are these emanations? In the Four Zoas, Tharmas talks about my crystal form that lived in my bosom. They seem to have the same sort of relationship that Eve does to Adam in Genesis, being formed out of the matter of the male. So that's a lot about the sons of Los, each of whom have their own emanations, but I think you get the picture. I'm going to apologize for these final two slides that we have. This first one is a family tree of all of these characters showing the different relationships and emanations. I don't think it's particularly legible or clear, even if you could read it from the distance that you're at, but it gives you...
Pull it up on your phone, right?
Yeah, it's like off the internet. So.
Yeah.
It gives you a sense, I hope, of the number of characters we're talking about and their complex net of interrelationships. Even so, it's not complete. If you read the Four Zoas, you'll see that he gets the 12 sons of Jacob in here too, as well as a bunch of other minor characters. And then finally, I'm going to move on to something from Northrop Frye.
Oh, yeah.
This is useful, but as you'll see, Frye did a lot of work not only to categorize Blake's ideas into the categories Blake himself made explicit, but also the ones implicit in the patterns of his poetry. A character like Tharmas or Urizen is not only associated with their eternal and earthly forms and their emanations, but also with poetic patterns that associate them with places, elements, types of metals, colors, virtues, and vices, and so on. I understand that this might seem a little overwhelming, but this is the poetic imagination, folks, at least if you're William Blake. This is the act of artistic understanding, which is also creation, which starts with the primal body of the universal man, who is God and man, and whose emanation is the city of God, which then falls and shatters and becomes the world we know and the worlds we can see and imagine, and everything we can think of and perceive within that fallen world. These are the broken pieces of our existence. But I want to bring it all together as best I can. You can see that with this large cast of characters, there's a lot of potential to represent different aspects of Blake's individual mythology and the imaginative vision. And in the long later poems, Blake will use them to tell the entire story of the universe from the fall of Albion to the final redemption of universal humanity. This is the subject especially of his last and longest poem, Jerusalem. When the doors of perception are cleared and the vision of man as God is clearly seen, pain and tyranny will pass away. The lion and the wolf shall cease, he says. And the body of the broken giant Albion will be restored through the integration of his emanation, which is the eternal city of God known as Jerusalem. What would that be like? Now, and my portion here, with a few lines from the poem, The Four Zoas, that might give an indication. The sun has left his blackness and has found a fresher morning. And the mild moon rejoices in the clear and cloudless night, and man walks forth from midst of the fires, the evil is all consumed. His eyes behold the angelic spheres arising night and day, the stars consumed like a lamp blown out, and in their stead behold the expanding eyes of man, behold the depths of wondrous worlds, one earth, one sky beneath, nor erring globes wander, but stars of fire rise up nightly from the ocean, and one sun each morning like a newborn man issues with songs and joy, calling the plowman to his labor and the shepherd to his rest. He walks upon the eternal mountains, raising his heavenly voice, conversing with the animal forms of wisdom night and day that risen from the sea of fire renewed walk o'er the earth. For Tharmas brought his flocks upon the hills, and in the vales around the eternal man's bright tent the little children play among the woolly flocks. The hammer of Urthona sounds in the deep caves beneath, his limbs renewed, his lions roar around the furnaces, and in the evening sport upon the plains. They raise their faces from the earth, conversing with the man. How is it we have walked through fires and yet are not consumed? How is it that all things are changed, even as in ancient times? Just a minute or two for questions.
Yeah, questions?
What do we Google to find those charts that you have?
Oh, I think, honestly, I think if you were just to put in like William Blake mythology, will have some things up.
Four Zoas will pop up.
Four Zoas will pop that up. I think if you even do like a weird like character chart, it's funny to me because even as much as Blake did not like Greek mythology, it kind of looks like a Greek mythology family tree when you look at some of it,
It does, doesn't it?
like all of Neptune's children, right?
It's interesting
Yeah.
to me how much you can parallel like the level of complexity just when you like today, modern day we have MCU, which is at least as complicated.
Yeah, I know.
And this is just normal for us.
Yeah, well, and it's funny because I've been reading some things lately about, has the Marvel universe become inaccessible now for kind of your average person because we've moved away from sort of the main cast, right? Now we're getting into what people would say is more obscure, and it's like, but it's not. I would say it's obscure if you're in that world, right? And I think with Blake, it's kind of getting to know the world, and once you're in it, it becomes a lot more accessible once you realize, oh, okay, this is what orc is kind of across the board, and
Yeah, just to have some handholds, I think, is useful.
yeah.
I mean, somebody like Keats, who I mentioned earlier, writes poems that use Arthurian mythology, like, the audience would already know that. You don't need to explain
Yeah.
who Guinevere is.
Right.
But Blake makes his own story.
Yeah, so it's different.
What are the specters? If the emanations are female forms, he often talks about these characters having specters. What's going on there?
I think, don't quote me on this, but I think that's their versions within time. The Spectre of Orthona is a big character in the Four Zillas. I think it's the broken versions of these eternal forms that operate within time, but I might not be completely correct in that.
Thank you.
So, by saying, Christ is Orcus, is he saying that, like, in his mythology or his imagination, Christ becomes like the devil? Or
His church did.
The church, yeah.
The Christian church is arisen in
Yeah.
Blake's time.
Yeah, because we see that as that symbol of hierarchical, power.
Stagnation.
Yeah, exactly, versus perhaps what people would really interpret as Jesus's role. Yeah.
Did you say that Blake's original name is named Albion, as in like another word for England?
Exactly.
Yes.
Does that predates Blake, right, or is it from Blake?
Yes, it was already known as a word for England in Blake's time.
Yeah.
And
That feels very English. It doesn't feel like Blake.
I know, right? Yeah. Yeah, ancient word there.
I didn't talk about it very much, but Albion is England, but is also universal humanity, and that's if you're familiar with the hymn Jerusalem, for we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land, which is kind of the unofficial anthem of England.
Right.
It's actually not from Jerusalem. It's the opening lyric from Milton.
Yeah, it's Milton.
It's extracted from that and set to music, but it equates England with the Holy Land and the regenerated city of God, Jerusalem.
Yeah, naturally. Yeah.
As one does.
Yeah, as you do.
Criticize imperialism and you cannot escape from the mindset.
Yeah, well, I think that's what's, as been mentioned, that his contradictory nature of having such a wide vision, and yet we still see those bits of a man from his time, right?
Oh,
Even
sure.
though he was quite outside of it. So.
Getting back to the whole different laws for people, that was the core justification of slavery. We treat them differently because they are different to us.
Yeah, and of course he would reject that because he has many kind of slightly uncomfortable pose that it's kind of uncomfortably racialized in a present moment,
Right.
but it's all about how, regardless of your color, and specifically talking about enslaved Africans, we're all part of the city of God, the giant
Right.
Albion.
And he's just using the vocabulary he could at this time for
Yeah.
some of that.
But yeah, he would reject it on theological principles too. So you just can't treat a human being. You can't treat animals in that way too. There's a whole, I didn't get into it, but there's all this stuff about animals within play.
Yes.
The starving dog at the door. And so I don't think it was a vegetarian.
No.
But he equated cruelty to animals with just one step below cruelty to humans.
Exactly.
Do you think did he desire a a shift, like ideally, would he have enjoyed a shift in the culture around him because of the power of his work? Or do you think he cared or thought that was even possible?
He carried.
I think he cared.
Yeah, it was. He gave one exhibition of his work in London, to which nobody came, except one reviewer who gave him a dismally dispiriting, awful review that it's too heartbreaking for me to
It's
even
terrible.
quote from it right now. Essentially, insane, you know. And so he had his work would probably not be as obscure if he had any audience whatsoever in his time. You know, he might have bent it a little bit toward making people understand it, but he was absolutely ignored. So at the end of his life, he did have kind of a small group of younger poets who looked up to him as visionary. I think they called themselves the Ancients.
The Ancients, or, yeah.
But it was too little, too late.
Yeah.
And made very little money, died poor.
Yeah, and I think it's that, you know, again, a man before his time, whereas what was popular was, you know, different romanticism or, you know, he just didn't fit into that narrative for them, so.
But he saw himself as espousing a helpful or productive philosophy that other humans should
Yes.
Yeah, I
ideally
think
try to.
especially with regards to the equality of people
Yeah.
and his views on slavery, for sure.
When you see God's truth, you know, I guess you just have to try to convince others that this is the way to behave.
Yeah, because then of course, whereas Blake is using, this is my truth of what I think God is saying about all of us as equals, of course you have others on the other side knowing, no, God has put us in different levels,
Yeah.
and we're here and they're here.
Well, we've run a little bit over time, so but I want to apologize for how quickly the speedy overview. Hopefully, you can see the linear.
This could have been a semester, you know, year-long class for your English lit,
Blake,
right?
go.
Yeah.
Thanks for
Hopefully,
taking
you see the
questions.
lineaments
Yeah.
of a more complete understanding of Blake. And hopefully, it'll give you some sense of why Blake would. When he saw sunrise, he didn't see a round, fiery disk
Right.
about the size of a
He
guinea,
saw
but
something more.
an innumerable company of heavenly hosts.
Yeah.
Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty.
Yeah.
So to quote Blake one last time, the goal here for this hour was to see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. Thank you.
It's true.